They tell you that the abyss is a place you go when you die, but they're lying. The abyss is a predator, and in 1974, it found a door. This is the footage the Vatican spent 50 years and millions of dollars to erase from the collective memory of the faithful. You are looking at Sister Maria, a woman who spent 20 years in silent prayer, only to have that silence shattered by a voice that predates the stars. Look closely at the grain of the film. Look at the way the shadows in the corner of the cell seem to move independently of the light. That isn't a technical glitch. That is the physical manifestation of a presence so heavy it warps the very air around it. Science wants to call this hysteria. The church wants to call it affliction. But as you watch her jaw unhinge, as you see her tendons stretch to the point of snapping, ask yourself, does hysteria allow a human being to speak in a dead Sumerian dialect? Does a medical condition cause the temperature in a stone room to drop 40 degrees in 3 seconds? Brace yourself, because what you are about to hear isn't a woman's voice. It is a sonic ritual. When she opens her mouth to scream the name of the morning star, she isn't just making sound, she is inviting it in. This is the raw, unedited, and forbidden record of the moment a human soul was evicted to make room for a king of hell. You've spent your life wondering what lies behind the veil. Tonight, the veil is torn. Welcome to the Occultic Abyss. To understand the scream, we must first understand the silence that preceded it. The convent of San Girolamo sat perched on a jagged limestone cliff in the northern Apennines, a place where the wind doesn't just blow, it moans through the cracks of ancient masonry like a wounded animal. This was the home of Sister Maria. For 2 decades, she was the golden child of the order, a woman of such profound, hollowed-out devotion that the other sisters whispered she was already halfway to sainthood. She spoke only when necessary, her life a repetitive loop of prayer, penance, and the scrubbing of stone floors until her knuckles bled. But the abyss does not seek out the wicked, it seeks out the empty. It looks for the vessels so hollowed by discipline that there is room for something else to take root. The descent began in the winter of 1973, the coldest on record. It started not with a bang, but with a smell. The heavy, sweet scent of lilies in the chapel began to curdle, replaced by the unmistakable oily stench of wet fur and scorched copper. The Mother Superior recorded in her private journals, diaries that were later lost in a mysterious fire, that Maria had begun to talk in her sleep. Not in Italian, and not in the Latin of the liturgy. She was whispering in a tongue that sounded like stones grinding together, a rhythmic, guttural chant that made the other nuns wake up with nosebleeds and a paralyzing sense of dread. Maria began to change physically. Her skin, once porcelain and clear, took on a gray, translucent quality, as if the blood beneath the surface was turning to ash. She stopped eating. Not a fast of devotion, but a total rejection of the living world. Witnesses claimed she would stand in the center of the courtyard for 6 hours at a time, staring directly into the sun without blinking, her eyes wide and glassy, reflecting a sky that no one else could see. The final straw, the moment the church realized this was no mere illness, occurred during the Feast of the Epiphany. As the priest raised the Eucharist, Maria didn't kneel. She didn't pray. She stood up, her spine cracking with a sound like dry kindling snapping in the wind, and let out a low, vibrating hum that shattered every stained glass window in the eastern wing simultaneously. When the shards of glass fell, they didn't cut her. They seemed to avoid her, swirling around her feet like iron filings drawn to a magnet. It was then that the bishop was summoned. It was then that the cameras were brought in, not to document a miracle, but to capture the expiration of a human soul. They thought they were going to save her. They didn't realize they were just setting the stage for a grand entrance. The girl they knew as Maria was already gone. Something ancient, something starving, was now wearing her skin like a borrowed shroud, waiting for the red light of the camera to signal its debut. The transition from afflicted to occupied is never sudden. It is a slow, methodical erasure of the self. By the spring of 1974, The woman known as Sister Maria had become a walking shadow, a hollow reed through which a dark wind was beginning to blow. The slow burn began in the cloisters, not with screams, but with a terrifying, unnatural stillness. The other sisters began to find marks left in Maria's wake. It started in the chapel. Every morning, the heavy iron crucifixes that lined the halls were found turned exactly 180 degrees, not upside down, but facing the wall, as if the icons themselves could no longer bear to look at what was walking among them. When the nuns tried to write them, the metal was reported to be searingly hot to the touch, leaving blisters in the shape of the Christ figure on their palms. Then came the auditory manifestations. It wasn't just Maria's voice anymore. Visitors to the convent reported a sound that seemed to come from inside the walls, a rhythmic, wet thumping, like a massive heart beating beneath the floorboards. In the dead of night, the silence of the mountains was punctured by the sound of Maria laughing. But it wasn't the laugh of a woman. It was a dry, rattling sound, the sound of dead leaves skittering over a grave, and it came from her cell even when she was observed to be in a state of catatonic sleep. But the most aggressive sign, the one that forced the Vatican's hand, was the knowledge. Maria began to speak secrets. As the sisters passed her in the hall, she would whisper their darkest shames, sins confessed only in the privacy of the box, names of abandoned children, thoughts of suicide, and hidden hungers, all delivered in a voice that sounded like several people speaking in perfect, terrifying unison. She wasn't guessing, she was reading the stains on their souls. She looked through them, her eyes now clouded with a milky, opalescent film, as if she were seeing a world layered directly over our own. Then, the physical boundaries of reality began to fail. A young novice reported entering the refectory to find Maria levitating just 3 inches off the stone floor. She wasn't floating in a divine ecstasy. She was twitching, her limbs jerking in violent, angular spasms as if she were a marionette being operated by a drunkard. Her fingernails had been torn to the quick, not by her own hand, but by something trying to claw its way out from under her skin. The air around her grew thick and ionized, smelling of ozone and rotting meat. Animals on the convent grounds, the stray cats and the livestock, began to die in circles, their hearts simply stopping the moment Maria walked past. This wasn't a haunting. This was a colonization. The first signs were over. The invitation had been accepted. The entity was no longer knocking at the door. It had kicked it off the hinges and was now rearranging the furniture of her mind. The slow burn was reaching the end of the fuse, and the explosion that followed would be recorded on film, a scream that would echo through the abyss forever. When the church finally permitted a secular intervention, they brought in the best minds that money and influence could buy. They arrived at the convent with their electroencephalograms, their primitive recording devices, and their cold, clinical arrogance. Led by Dr. Eris Thorne, a man who had spent his career deconstructing the miracles of the insane, they viewed Sister Maria not as a spiritual casualty, but as a fascinating specimen of late-stage hysteria and temporal lobe epilepsy. They came to explain her away. They stayed to watch their worldviews crumble. The scientific explanation began with the brain. Thorne and his team hypothesized that Maria was suffering from a rare, hyper-focused form of schizophrenia, one that allowed her to mimic the symptoms of possession through sheer, subconscious willpower. They hooked her up to the EEG, expecting to see the erratic spikes of a seizure. Instead, they found something that defied the laws of biology. The needles on the graph didn't spike, they flatlined. For 22 minutes, while Maria sat upright, her eyes wide and tracking the movements of the doctors, the machines recorded zero brain activity. Physically, she was a corpse. Biologically, she was dead. And yet, she spoke. She spoke to Dr. Thorne about his own mother's funeral, details he had never shared, a secret buried in a graveyard 3,000 miles away. The medical team stood paralyzed as the cadaver in the chair described the exact smell of the flowers at a service she could not possibly have known existed. They tried to explain her vocalizations as ventriloquism or vocal fold distortion. But when they placed a laryngoscope down her throat to see how she was producing the multitonal screams, the cameras didn't see a vibrating larynx. They saw a black, oily substance rising from her esophagus, a fluid that didn't exist in human anatomy, a liquid that sizzled when it touched the air and dissolved the medical instruments. The scientific explanation was no longer about medicine. It was about survival. Thorne's final report, which remains locked in a private archive today, contained a sentence that the scientific community refused to publish. "We are not witnessing a malfunction of the mind, but a replacement of the soul." He noted that the patient displayed a physical strength that defied the limits of human muscle and bone. During a routine blood draw, the needle didn't just break against her skin, it disintegrated into powder. The scientists began to suffer from sympathetic symptoms. Within 72 hours of being in the room with Maria, 2 orderlies suffered identical retinal hemorrhages, and Dr. Thorne himself reported a constant, high-pitched ringing that sounded like 1,000 voices screaming in a language he described as mathematical filth. The explanation had failed. There was no chemical imbalance that could explain why the shadows in the room pooled around Maria's feet like liquid. There was no psychological profile for a woman whose heart had stopped beating 3 days prior, yet who continued to grow stronger, louder, and more violent. Science had come to provide a cure. Instead, it provided a confirmation. As the doctors fled the convent, leaving behind their broken equipment and their shattered sanity, they realized the truth. They weren't looking at a patient. They were looking at a breach. And the thing inside that breach was finally ready to give the world a name. When the men of science fled, they left behind a vacuum that only the ancient rituals could fill. The Vatican didn't just send a priest, they sent a cleanup crew. Led by Bishop Vittorio Rossi, a man whose eyes had seen the rot in the catacombs of Rome, a team of high-ranking exorcists arrived under the cover of a moonless night. They didn't come with hope. They came with the grim, cold steel of those who know they are walking into a slaughterhouse of the soul. The church stepping in wasn't a moment of divine light. It was a desperate, aggressive attempt to contain a spill. As Rossi crossed the threshold of the convent, he didn't sprinkle holy water. He ordered the doors to be chained from the outside. He knew that what was in that room was no longer Sister Maria. It was a contagion, a spiritual plague that had finished incubating and was now looking for a way to spread. The narration of their arrival is a chronicle of immediate, physical rejection. As the bishop approached Maria's cell, the very stones of the convent began to weep, not water, but a thick, black bile that smelled of centuries-old rot and fermented copper. The air inside the hallway didn't just turn cold, it became heavy, a pressurized atmosphere that made the priests' ears bleed. Every prayer they uttered was met with a mocking, symphonic echo. For every word of Latin they spoke, a dozen voices from inside the room screamed back the inverse, a linguistic mirror that turned the holy liturgy into a roadmap to Gehenna. This wasn't a quiet battle of wills. It was a spiritual riot. When they entered the room, they found Maria suspended, not in grace, but in agony. Her body was arched back so far that her spine had begun to protrude through her skin, forming a jagged, bone-white ridge. She wasn't breathing, yet her chest was expanding and contracting with a violent force that shook the floorboards. The bishop didn't see a woman. He saw a breach. He saw a rip in the fabric of the mundane world through which the abyss was pouring. The aggression of the church was met with a terrifying, calculated violence. One of the assisting priests, a man of 30-year service, looked into Maria's eyes, which were now nothing more than 2 pools of shimmering, liquid obsidian, and he didn't see a demon. He saw nothing. A total, absolute void that sucked the air out of his lungs. He collapsed on the spot, his heart literally stopping from the sheer, overwhelming pressure of the vacuum within her. They began the Great Exorcism not to save her. They knew she was gone, but to seal the door. They hammered iron spikes blessed in the blood of martyrs into the 4 corners of the room, attempting to create a spiritual cage. But the entity was mocking them. It played with their fears like a cat with a broken bird. It mimicked the voices of their dead mothers. It whispered the names of their secret sins through Maria's bleeding lips. The church thought they were the hunters. They didn't realize that by entering that room, they had simply walked into the mouth of the abyss. And the camera, hidden in the corner by a terrified technician, was about to capture the moment the predator finally spoke its true name. Now, we reach the center of the void. This is the footage that was supposed to be reduced to ash in a Vatican furnace. 6 minutes of 16mm film that captured the precise moment a human being was hollowed out to serve as a mouthpiece for the nameless. Look at the frame. The quality is degraded, eaten away by a strange, localized radiation that only appeared in the presence of the entity. The film isn't just old, it looks wounded. In the center of the cell, Sister Maria is no longer a person. She is a twisted, architectural nightmare of bone and taut skin. Her limbs are locked in a geometric configuration that defies the limits of human anatomy. Her elbows are inverted, her neck elongated, her head snapped back at an angle that should have severed the spinal cord instantly. But look at the shadow she casts on the stone wall. The shadow isn't mimicking her. While Maria stands paralyzed, the shadow is moving. It is reaching out, expanding, its fingers elongating into claws that rake across the masonry of the room. This is the moment the unseen footage becomes a record of a physical breach. The silence in the room becomes a physical weight. You can see the dust motes in the air freeze in mid-fall. Then, the transformation completes. Maria's jaw begins to descend. It doesn't just open, it unhinges, the skin at the corners of her mouth tearing upward toward her ears. Her throat pulses with a rhythmic, mechanical force, as if a massive engine is being jump-started in her chest. And then, the sound. It isn't a scream. A scream is a human reaction to pain. This is an evocation. It is a multitonal, vibrating roar that hits the camera's microphone with the force of a physical blow. It is the sound of 1,000 iron gates grinding shut at once. It is the sound of a dying sun. Through the layers of digital rot and audio degradation, you hear it, the name that has been whispered in the darkest corridors of history to summon the end of days. Lucifer, Lord of the Abyss, the first and the last. The name isn't spoken, it is vomited into existence. The force of the sound causes the camera lens to crack. You can see the spiderweb fractures spreading across the screen as the air in the room ignites. For a split second, the infrared sensors on the film capture a shape standing behind her, a towering, multi-limbed silhouette made of pure, light-drinking darkness. The entity isn't possessing her anymore. It is wearing her like a tattered rag. This is the peak of the abyss. This is the footage they said didn't exist because to acknowledge it is to acknowledge that the walls of our reality are paper thin, and there are things on the other side that have been waiting for centuries for someone like Maria to finally... When the scream finally died, it didn't leave silence, it left a vacuum. The aftermath of the Piacenza footage wasn't a return to normalcy, it was the beginning of a slow, agonizing fallout that claimed every soul that touched that room. The unseen footage isn't just a recording, it is a spiritual radioactive site. The first to fall were the witnesses. Bishop Rossi, the man who had stood feet away from the unhinged jaw of the abyss, never spoke another word of Latin. He returned to Rome a broken man, his hair turning snow-white within 48 hours. According to leaked medical files from the Vatican's private infirmary, Rossi spent the final 3 years of his life in a padded cell, clawing at his own ears until they were nothing but scar tissue. He claimed the scream hadn't stopped. He claimed that every time he closed his eyes, he wasn't seeing the back of his eyelids, he was seeing the floor of the pit. He died in 1977, weighing only 80 pounds, his body ravaged by a cancer that the doctors said looked like internal burns, as if he had been standing too close to a sun that didn't emit light, but shadow. Then there was the technician, the man who hid the camera. His fate was perhaps the most aggressive warning of all. He was found 3 months later in a basement apartment in Milan. He hadn't just committed suicide, he had attempted to erase himself. Every photograph of his face had been burned. Every mirror in his home was smashed, and the shards were found arranged in the same geometric pattern Maria's limbs had formed during the peak. The film reel was found clutched to his chest, his fingers fused to the metal canister by a heat that hadn't triggered the building's fire alarms. And what of Sister Maria? The church claims she passed away from natural causes shortly after the exorcism. But the abyss doesn't leave survivors. Local folklore in the Apennines tells a darker tale. They say that for decades after, the convent was haunted by a walking void. Not a ghost, but a pocket of dead air that would move through the halls. Any plant life it passed would turn to black sludge instantly. Any bird that flew over the roof would drop dead mid-flight. The ground where Maria's chair sat during the peak remains barren to this day. Not even the hardiest weeds will grow there. The soil is chemically identical to volcanic ash, despite being in the heart of a lush mountain range. The fallout extended to the film itself. Every copy made of the unseen footage seemed to carry a piece of the entity with it. Archivists who handled the master tapes reported a phenomenon known as shadow bleed, where the darkness in the footage would seem to leak out onto the surrounding frames of other films stored in the same vault. The Vatican didn't just hide the footage because it was scandalous, they hid it because it was active. It is a visual ritual, a digital doorway that opens a little wider every time a new pair of eyes witnesses the scream. You aren't just watching a documentary tonight. You are participating in the fallout. You are touching the same radiation that melted the mind of Bishop Rossi. The abyss doesn't care if you believe in it, it only cares that you are looking. And now that you've seen the aftermath, now that you've traced the path of the rot, there is no going back. You have breathed in the smoke of a fire that is still burning in the deep. To the uninitiated, Maria's scream was just a sound. To those of us who study the abyss, it was a key. We must look past the horror and analyze the occult architecture of this event. In the esoteric traditions of the left-hand path, a possession of this magnitude is not an accident. It is a living sigil. Maria's body didn't contort because of pain. It was being folded into a specific physical frequency designed to resonate with the lower planes. Her limbs, her spine, even the angle of her unhinged jaw were forming a human gait, a flesh and bone antenna tuned to the vibration of the adversary. Why that name? Why then? The name Lucifer is often misunderstood by the masses as a mere synonym for evil. But in the deep occult, it represents the phosphorus, the light bringer of the dark. When Maria screamed that name, she wasn't calling out to a red-skinned myth. She was invoking the primordial force of gnosis through terror. She was announcing the return of the Black Sun. According to the Codex Gigas and the forbidden fragments of the Sumerian Abyss Walkers, perfect vessel only appears once every 7 centuries. Maria was the culmination of a bloodline of silence, a vacuum created by generations of suppressed energy that finally snapped. Look at the way the light died in that room. In occult theory, this is known as Vantablack manifestation. The entity doesn't just block light, it consumes the very concept of illumination. This is why the film looks wounded. The entity was literally eating the photons before they could hit the lens. It was a localized collapse of the physical laws of our universe. We must also address the language of the void. The multitonal nature of her scream is what the ancients called the chorus of the disinherited. It is the sound of 1,000 shattered egos speaking through a single throat. In the Goetic tradition, names have power, but vibrations have dominion. By screaming that name with that specific, inhuman resonance, Maria wasn't just identifying the entity, she was painting the name onto the walls of our reality. She was tattooing the abyss onto the fabric of the convent. This is why the site remains barren. This is why the film bleeds. You are looking at a permanent scar on the world. To the church, it's a tragedy. To the scientists, it's an anomaly. But to the occultist, it is a triumph. It is proof that the walls are thin, that the abyss is hungry, and that it only takes one hollowed-out soul to bring the King of Shadows into the light of the midday sun. You are witnessing the birth of a new darkness, one that doesn't hide in the closet, but stands in the center of the room and screams its name until the world itself begins to crack. We have reached the end of the tape, but for you, the silence is just beginning. What did you really see today? Was it the tragic breakdown of a lonely woman? Or was it the moment the basement of the universe finally gave way? The Vatican would have you believe that the Piacenza footage is a closed file, a relic of a superstitious past. But you know better. You felt the shift in the air. You felt that primal lizard brain twitch when the scream hit its peak. The final verdict isn't something I can give you. It's something you are already feeling in the pit of your stomach. Because there is an old truth in the occult. When you stare into the abyss doesn't just look back, it moves in. By watching this, by hearing that name, you have allowed a frequency into your home that wasn't there 10 minutes ago. You have participated in the record. You have become a witness to the unseen, and the unseen now has your scent. Is Sister Maria a victim, or is she a pioneer? Is she the warning, or is she the invitation? As you sit there in the glow of your screen, look into the corners of your own room. Notice how the shadows seem just a little deeper than they were before. Notice the way the silence feels. Heavy. That is the fallout. That is the mark of the occultic abyss. We don't just tell stories here. We document the erasure of the boundary between us and them. If you have the courage to stand at the edge of the pit, then stay with us. But do not expect comfort. Do not expect light. Join the abyss. If you felt the vibration of that name in your marrow, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell. Not for notifications, but as a tolling for the world we used to know. Leave a comment to show you've survived the viewing, or tell us which unseen archive we should unearth next. But remember, once the door is open, it never truly closes. Sleep with the lights on tonight. Not because it will save you, but because it's the only way you'll see them coming. Welcome to the family. Welcome to the occultic abyss. We'll be waiting for you in the dark.